Dana looked at me across the kitchen like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome and said, very calmly, "This is my house now. You have no say here." A few minutes later, she started talking about my college trust like it was something the household should reconsider. Like the money my mom left for me was suddenly a family resource she could redistribute. I didn't argue with her in that moment. I just sat there, listening, already knowing I would save every message, every email,
every little comment that followed. And that night, while the house was quiet, I started packing the things that actually mattered to me. My name is Lena Carrington. I'm 19. I remember standing there thinking that sentence sounded final, but it wasn't the end of anything. The year my mother died didn't feel real for a long time. It's strange how quiet grief can be at first. People expect loud crying, dramatic moments, something visible. But what I remember most is how still everything felt. The house was the same house it had always been, same walls, same furniture, same kitchen table, but it felt like the air had shifted slightly, like something important had been removed and nothing quite fit the same way anymore. My mom had always been the center of our routines without anyone really saying it out loud. She was the one who remembered little things. Appointments, birthdays, what groceries we were running low on, which plants in the yard needed attention. After she was gone, all of that quiet structure disappeared with her. For a while, my father moved through the house like someone trying to keep up appearances. He went to work, answered calls, handled the practical things people had to handle when someone dies. But the emotional part of it, the actual loss, was something he didn't really talk about. Not with me. The months after the funeral blurred together. Friends and relatives visited less often. The sympathy calls stopped. Eventually, it was just the two of us again in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. Then, less than a year later, my father told me he had started seeing someone. Her name was Dana Whitmore. I remember the moment he said it because of how carefully he chose his words, like he had rehearsed them in his head beforehand. He talked about companionship, about how difficult the past year had been, about how people sometimes needed support after loss. I nodded while he explained it, but something about the timing made my chest tighten in a way I didn't quite know how to explain. Not long after that conversation, Dana came over for dinner. She was confident in a way that filled the room immediately, not loud exactly, just certain of herself. She spoke easily with my father, laughed at his stories, asked polite questions about school and my plans. On the surface, it probably looked completely normal. But I remember feeling like I was watching someone step into a space that still felt unfinished. Within months, things moved faster. My father told me they were getting married. There wasn't a long engagement or a slow adjustment period. It was more like a decision had been made and everything else just followed behind it. The wedding itself was small and quick, and before I had really processed what was happening, Dana was no longer someone visiting our house. She was living there. And she didn't come alone. Her daughter, Kelsey, moved in too. Kelsey was close to my age, maybe a little younger. She brought boxes of clothes, decorations, school things, pieces of a life that were suddenly being arranged inside the same house where my life had always existed. The first few weeks felt like everyone was trying to perform normalcy. Meals together, casual conversations. My father using phrases like "our family now," said in a tone that sounded hopeful but also slightly forced, like he needed it to become true if he repeated it enough times. Dana tried to establish routines almost immediately. New schedules for dinners, new expectations about shared spaces, small adjustments that seemed practical on the surface. But even in those early days, before anything openly hostile had happened, there was this quiet discomfort underneath everything. It wasn't a single moment. It was the feeling of being slightly out of place, in rooms that had always been mine. At first, the changes inside the house were small enough that you could almost convince yourself they didn't mean anything. Dana had a way of presenting everything as simple adjustments. Practical things. Improvements, even. She would move something, replace something, reorganize a cabinet, and it always came with the same calm explanation that she was just trying to make the house work better. My father rarely questioned any of it. The kitchen was where I noticed the first real shift. For as long as I could remember, my mom had kept this thick recipe binder on the second shelf beside the stove. It wasn't fancy. Just a worn 3-ring binder with clear plastic sleeves inside it. Some pages were printed recipes, but most of them were handwritten notes, little adjustments she'd made over the years, ingredients crossed out and replaced with better ones, small comments scribbled in the margins. Things like "add more garlic next time," or "Lena likes this version better." It wasn't something I looked at every day, but it had always been there. One afternoon, I opened the binder while I was making something simple for myself, and at first I couldn't figure out why it looked wrong. The pages were still there, but the handwritten notes were gone. The plastic sleeves that had held those pages were suddenly empty. Some of the original printed recipes were still inside, neatly arranged, but the little pieces of paper my mom had written on over the years had disappeared. I stood there for a long moment flipping through it slowly, thinking maybe they had just been moved somewhere else. Maybe Dana had reorganized the binder and put them in a different section. But the more I searched through the pages, the clearer it became that they simply weren't there anymore. When I asked about it later, the explanation was casual. Something about cleaning up clutter in the kitchen, about making the binder easier to follow. It was said in the same tone someone might use when they replace an old sponge at the sink. But that binder hadn't been clutter. Those little notes had been pieces of my mom. After that, I started noticing other changes. Dinner routines shifted almost immediately. The kinds of meals we ate changed, the time we sat down changed, even the way the table was set looked different. Dana liked things arranged a certain way, and gradually the kitchen started reflecting her preferences instead of the ones I had grown up with. Nothing dramatic, just steady, quiet replacement. The same thing started happening in the yard. Behind the house, there was a small corner where my mom had kept an herb garden. It wasn't big, just a few wooden planters with basil, rosemary, thyme, things she used when she cooked. I used to help her water them when I was younger, especially during the summer. One weekend I came home, and the planters were gone. The soil had been cleared out, the space leveled, and a completely different setup was being put in its place. Decorative stones, new plants that had nothing to do with cooking, things that looked more like landscaping choices than something someone actually used. Again, the explanation was simple: a redesign, a cleaner look. No one acted like anything important had been removed. And that's when something started settling in the back of my mind, a quiet realization I didn't say out loud to anyone yet. The house itself wasn't changing all at once. But piece by piece, detail by detail, it felt like someone was slowly rewriting it. It wasn't long after those quiet changes around the house that Dana brought up the education trust my mom had left for me. The first time it happened, it didn't even sound like a serious conversation. It was during dinner one evening, the kind of night where everyone was technically sitting together but not really connecting. Plates clinking, small talk drifting in and out, my father scrolling through something on his phone between bites. Dana had been talking about future plans for a while, college timelines, tuition costs, things like that. At first I assumed she was talking about Kelsey. But then the direction of the conversation shifted. She mentioned the trust fund my mom had set up. The way she said it sounded almost casual, like she was referencing something everyone already understood. She spoke about it as part of a broader discussion about family resources and planning for the future. I remember the exact moment my attention locked onto the conversation. It wasn't what she said first. It was the word fair. Dana started suggesting that it might be worth revisiting how the trust was structured. Her tone stayed calm and reasonable, almost thoughtful, as if she were proposing something practical rather than something that would directly affect my future. She talked about how blended families had to think differently, how situations changed when households merged, how sometimes plans made years earlier needed to be reconsidered so that everyone had equal opportunities. The way she framed it, she wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. She simply suggested that it might be fair if some of the money in my education trust could eventually help Kelsey too. For a moment, the table went very still. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me was waiting for my father to shut the idea down. The trust had been created specifically for me by my mother. It wasn't a general family account or something that had been left open to interpretation. It had a purpose. So I waited for him to say something that would end the conversation. But he didn't. My father didn't agree with Dana outright, but he also didn't reject what she was saying. Instead, he did something that felt strangely worse. He avoided it. He shifted slightly in his chair, glanced down at his plate, and responded in that careful tone people use when they're trying to keep a discussion from turning into an argument. He mentioned that it was a complicated situation, something that might need time to think about. The conversation moved on not long after that. Dinner continued like nothing unusual had happened. Kelsey talked about something related to school, Dana discussed a project she was working on, and my father eventually stood up to clear his plate. On the surface, it probably looked like an ordinary evening. But the moment had already landed. Because what stayed with me wasn't just Dana bringing up the trust. It was the realization that my father had allowed the idea to exist in the first place. He hadn't stopped it. He hadn't reminded anyone that the money had been set aside by my mother for a specific reason. He had simply let the suggestion sit there on the table. And in that quiet space where the conversation should have ended, I started understanding something that hadn't fully formed in my mind before. The house wasn't just changing. The things my mother had put in place for my future were starting to look like they might change too. Almost immediately after that conversation about the trust, the dynamics in the house began to shift in ways that were subtle at first, but quickly became impossible to ignore. Dana and Kelsey started quietly taking over spaces that had always felt like mine. The living room was the first noticeable change. My mom had kept a small reading corner by the window, a chair, and a little side table where I'd often sit with a book or my laptop. One morning I noticed the chair had been moved, a new lamp set up, and Kelsey sitting there like she had always belonged. When I went to sit anyway, Dana's calm but firm tone reminded me, Kelsey likes it there now. You'll have to find another spot. There was no negotiation, only subtle assertion of ownership. The kitchen followed. The small counter where I used to do my homework while Mom cooked had new bar stools, carefully arranged for Kelsey. I could still use the space if I needed, but every time I did, I felt watched like I was intruding. Even little things in the hallway, where my backpack went, which shelf in the bathroom held my things, started being reorganized to suit them. It wasn't loud, it wasn't screaming, it wasn't overt confrontation. But over days and weeks, the message became crystal clear. This house wasn't mine in the same way anymore. Criticism came next. Dana would comment on my grades in passing, on my clothes, on the way I spoke to my father. Kelsey chimed in occasionally, teasing small things as if to reinforce that I didn't fit the new rhythm of the household. And slowly, my father began to adopt some of her language, not directly, but in those quiet suggestions. Maybe you're being a little difficult, Lena, he'd say, more gently than I expected but still pointed. I began noticing a pattern. Whenever something went wrong, or even slightly off, I was the one who was framed as the problem. Family dinners where I didn't speak up were labeled as aloof or ungrateful. When I tried to contribute, the effort was often ignored or critiqued. It wasn't one dramatic accusation, it was a steady drip, shaping the narrative of me as the difficult one, the one causing issues, without ever having to raise a voice. At first, I was confused. I wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe I was imagining the small exclusions, the subtle shifts, the glances and quiet directives. But over time, the accumulation of moments left a clear pattern. The house I had grown up in was no longer a safe or neutral space. That's when I started protecting myself quietly. I created a private folder on my laptop, carefully saving screenshots of messages between Dana and my father, saving emails that hinted at plans to redirect my future resources, jotting down conversations with times, dates, and what was said. Every note, every image, every email was a small thread in a growing record. It started to feel less like paranoia and more like preparation. My confusion began to harden into something else, an awareness that the people who should have been my support were no longer allies, and that if I wanted to preserve my future, I needed to act quietly, deliberately, and without letting them know I was paying attention. For the first time in months, a part of me that had been tired and reactive began to shift toward vigilance. The subtle erasure and constant blame had taught me one thing very clearly. I couldn't just exist in this house anymore. I needed to protect myself. By the time the next holiday season rolled around, the subtle shifts in the house had begun to feel like walls closing in from every direction. Dana started establishing rules about who I could see outside the house, framing it as family loyalty and household harmony. At first, it was small things, asking me to text before I visited a cousin, suggesting I limit time at friends' houses. But soon it became more pointed. My mom's older sister, Aunt Teresa, had always been my closest family outside the home. She'd been a confidant, a source of comfort, and someone who remembered my mom in ways no one else did. Now Dana was actively trying to limit that connection. The first clear moment came when the family holiday dinner at Aunt Teresa's was approaching. I remember the night vividly. Dana had just finished preparing the living room for what she called a family planning meeting. A term that sounded innocuous, but always carried an undertone of control. "I don't think it's appropriate for you to go this time," she said, her voice smooth but firm, almost rehearsed. "We need to focus on the home, the new family dynamics, and you being here with us. Family loyalty comes first, Lena." I froze. Part of me wanted to argue, to protest that Aunt Teresa was still my family, my blood, and that Mom would have wanted me to be there. But something in Dana's tone, so calm, so assured, made it clear that arguing would be interpreted as defiance, and defiance had consequences I wasn't ready to face. I turned to my father, looking for him to step in, to remind her that this was about more than routines or loyalty. But he didn't. He shifted his weight, looked away, muttered something vague about keeping the peace, and left it at that. His silence felt heavier than any words she could have spoken. In that instant, the situation crystallized. Dana wasn't just taking over the house physically. She was shaping my relationships, rewriting who I could rely on, and redefining loyalty to fit her narrative. She wasn't openly confrontational in the way some step-parents might be in a storybook. She was subtle, precise, almost surgical in removing my support system without leaving visible scars for others to see. I remember sitting in my room later, staring at the closed door that separated me from the rest of the house, feeling that creeping mix of anger and helplessness. For weeks, I replayed that evening in my head, the way Dana's smile didn't reach her eyes, the almost imperceptible smirk when my father didn't intervene, the way Kelsey looked at me like I was the intruder. That night, I started taking notes on the first incidents where my extended family connections were being limited. Screenshots of texts where Dana had told me I needed to stay home. Small scribbled logs of conversations where she reframed my desire to see Aunt Teresa as selfish or disruptive. Every word, every detail was carefully documented. The emotional shift was subtle but undeniable. What had started as confusion, wondering if I was overreacting, slowly hardened into a guarded awareness. I realized that protection wasn't just about my things or my room anymore. It was about maintaining access to the people who still remembered me, who still remembered my mom, and who could remind me that I belonged somewhere outside the house Dana was remaking in her image. By the time the holiday rolled around, I knew that standing quietly and documenting everything was the only control I had left over my own life and connections. I knew what Dana had said, and I knew what my father wouldn't do. But that night, when the holiday dinner at Aunt Teresa's house came, I made a choice. I left the house anyway. My backpack was slung over my shoulder, my laptop tucked safely inside, and my folder of saved messages and notes felt heavier than usual, but in a grounding way. It was proof I had some control left, some small assertion of my own will. Driving to my aunt's home, I felt a tension in my chest that was equal parts fear and relief. I kept rehearsing how I would explain my presence, how I'd skirt Dana's rules without making it sound confrontational. And when I arrived, the moment I walked in, the relief hit me like a wave. Aunt Teresa's house smelled like cinnamon and roasted vegetables, familiar and warm, a contrast to the quiet scrutiny of my own home. She came around the table, hugged me tightly, whispered, "I was worried you wouldn't come," and that alone made the tension inside me start to unravel. Cousins, a few neighbors, even friends from earlier family gatherings, smiled and welcomed me without hesitation. No judgment. No one questioning my presence. For a few hours, I felt like myself again, the daughter, the niece, the girl who had been slowly edged out of her home. Conversation flowed, laughter filled the spaces, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of constant observation. It wasn't perfect. I still remembered everything Dana had started doing, everything my father hadn't stopped. But in that room, surrounded by people who knew and loved my mom, I felt seen. That sense of normalcy made leaving all the more difficult. I lingered longer than I should have, helping set plates on the counter and chatting quietly with my aunt about plans for the next week. It was almost easy to forget that outside those doors, the other house still existed, Dana, Kelsey, and my father waiting to assert control. And then it hit, the moment I returned. Pulling into the driveway, I could see them. My father standing by the front door, Dana beside him, and Kelsey hovering slightly behind. What made my stomach knot wasn't just that they were there. It was the additional surprise. Several relatives were in the living room, sitting stiffly, watching, as if the entire house had been waiting for this confrontation. I stepped inside and the air shifted immediately. Dana's smile was sharp, almost predatory, as she spoke first. "So, you decided to go against my instructions," she said, voice calm but full of underlying venom. My father's tone followed, flat and almost rehearsed. "You need to apologize to Dana, right now." I froze. Part of me wanted to argue, to justify why I had gone. But I could feel the eyes of relatives on me, the scrutiny amplifying every heartbeat. Kelsey leaned slightly forward, smirking, adding silent reinforcement to the accusation. And there I was, standing in the middle of the living room I had known all my life, suddenly framed as the one who had disrespected the household, the one causing drama, in front of everyone who had come to celebrate a holiday. No one whispered. No one nudged me to the side. It was entirely public, entirely tense, and entirely deliberate. For a moment, I just looked at all of them, the relatives, my father, Dana, Kelsey, and felt the weight of every subtle erasure, every withheld word, every limitation they had placed on me over the past months crystallize in that one living room confrontation. And yet, despite the pressure, I didn't move. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just stood there, silently weighing my next move, feeling a clarity I hadn't had in months. This was the turning point, whether they realized it or not. Dana's voice cut through the silence of the living room, sharp and controlled, but loaded with accusation. "You've shown nothing but disrespect," she said, each word deliberate, measured, as if testing the room to see how far she could push. Her eyes were steady, almost cold, and the corners of her mouth tilted just enough to signal she expected obedience. "You don't get to make decisions for this house. You don't get to ignore what's expected of you." I felt my stomach tighten, the familiar mix of fear and indignation I'd been cultivating for months. My chest ached, not from physical pain, but from the pressure of being publicly framed as the troublemaker. The relatives in the room shifted, uneasy, watching the scene unfold as though waiting for me to break. Then my father's voice joined hers, low and deliberate, carrying that same sense of authority I had known as a child, but now twisted into something I didn't recognize. "You need to apologize to Dana. Right now," he said, his words firm, unyielding. There was no room for negotiation, no hint that this was even a discussion. His gaze lingered on me, waiting for the submission he assumed was owed. I remember the way my throat tightened. My first instinct was to defend myself, to argue that I had done nothing wrong, that the dinner had been my choice, that Aunt Teresa was family. But I stopped. I caught myself. I realized that anything I said in the heat of the moment would be twisted, reframed, and used against me later. Dana's expression didn't change. My father's gaze didn't waver. Kelsey sat a few feet away, smirking slightly, enjoying the discomfort that had been carefully constructed over months. Then came the threat, articulated almost casually but heavy with consequence. "If you don't apologize, Lena," my father said, voice dropping, "you'll face restrictions. Indefinitely. You'll be kept from spaces, from activities, from things you're used to, until you show you can behave appropriately." I could feel the tension in the room rising. Every relative in the room was aware of the power shift. They were witnesses. The walls, the furniture, the familiar holiday decorations, all seemed to close in as the threat lingered. For a moment, the weight of months of subtle erasure, criticism, and isolation pressed down on me. My mind raced, the impulse to cry or argue gnawing at me, but I realized something crucial. My power, however limited it seemed, was still mine. My mother's preparations, the careful documentation I had kept, the clarity I had slowly built over these months, they weren't nullified by Dana's words or my father's threats. I didn't say anything, I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I simply stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, the tension thick enough to taste. My refusal was quiet, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. My shoulders straightened slightly. My gaze met theirs, steady, unyielding. By not reacting in the way they expected, by refusing to beg, to apologize for something I hadn't done, I was making a statement. The house may have been trying to rewrite my role, the trust may have been under threat, and my father may have been silent too long. But in that living room, I was still present, still aware, still unwilling to be forced into submission. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the faint hum of the street outside filtered through my window, I found myself sitting on my bed, phone clutched tightly in my hand. My heart was still racing from the confrontation in the living room, the lingering weight of Dana's words and my father's threats pressing in as though the walls themselves were closing. I had to do something, anything, but I didn't know where to start. With a shaky breath, I dialed Ms. Alina Holloway, the estate attorney who had handled my mother's legal affairs. Her number was saved under my mom's contacts, a detail that now felt like a lifeline. When she answered, her calm, professional voice was enough to steady me for the first time that evening. "Ms. Holloway, it's Lena Carrington," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I don't know what to do. There's so much happening here, and I feel like I'm being forced out of my own home, and my trust might be in danger." I explained everything, the months of subtle erasure, the replacement of my mother's things, the restrictions on who I could see, and most importantly, Dana's recent push to access the education trust my mother had left for me. I didn't hold back, recounting each moment of public humiliation, the threats, and my father's silence. Ms. Holloway listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her tone calm but edged with concern. "Lena," she said finally, "from what you're describing, you're in a vulnerable position at home, but legally, you do have rights. There are options to protect both your living situation and the trust your mother established, but you need support to make the move safely." After hanging up, I felt a mix of relief and renewed anxiety. The pieces were there, I just needed the next step. That's when Aunt Teresa stepped in. I called her quietly the next morning, and within hours she arrived, her presence firm, comforting, and unwavering. She had seen enough over the years to know that Dana's control wasn't temporary, and she understood that waiting any longer could put me at risk. We sat together in her living room, reviewing the situation, discussing what had transpired, and making a plan. Aunt Teresa's calm decisiveness was exactly what I needed. She helped me see clearly that leaving the house wasn't giving up, it was reclaiming agency. By the end of the conversation, the decision had solidified. I would leave. Not angrily, not recklessly, but deliberately. I would pack what mattered most to me, the keepsakes from my mother, the documentation I had saved, and the essentials that allowed me to maintain some independence. I would step away from the constant pressure, the public humiliation, and the subtle but steady attempts to rewrite my life. It wasn't easy. I kept replaying the living room confrontation, the smirk on Kelsey's face, the silence of my father, and Dana's precise, venom-laced calm. But I also felt a strange clarity, the first real sense of control I had felt in months. With Aunt Teresa's support and Ms. Holloway's guidance, leaving the house wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And in that quiet determination, for the first time since Dana arrived, I felt like I had a path forward, one that I could walk on my own terms. The morning I decided to leave, the house felt heavier than usual, like it had somehow sensed the shift coming. I moved quietly from room to room, gathering the items I had earmarked for this escape. My mother's recipe notes, carefully preserved photographs, a few personal keepsakes that felt like pieces of her still lived in me, and the documentation I'd been saving for months. Each object I picked up carried memory, comfort, and proof, small talismans of the life I refused to relinquish. I hadn't gotten far when I heard the unmistakable click of the front door opening. My father was there, his face pale but tight with authority. "Lena, what are you doing?" he asked, voice measured, but with that edge that made the hair on my arms rise. He stepped forward, trying to reach for a box in my hands, but I didn't flinch. I could feel the tension coiling like a spring in my chest. "I'm taking my things," I said calmly, though my voice shook slightly. "They belong to me." Dana appeared behind him, her expression sharp, eyes narrowing. "You can't just take that," she said, the words soft but threatening. "You have no right." I could see my father falter, hesitation flashing across his face, but before the situation could spiral, Aunt Teresa stepped in. She had come with me, insisting on support, and her presence felt like armor. "Stop," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If you interfere with her belongings or the trust her mother set aside, I won't hesitate to involve law enforcement and file formal complaints. You understand that, right?" The authority in her voice shifted the energy immediately. My father's hand dropped slightly, his jaw tightening as he processed her warning. I could see the sudden realization in his eyes. This wasn't going to be easy for him or Dana. Within days, local authorities confirmed what Aunt Teresa had already assured me. Despite being only 16, just months away from turning 17, I could legally choose to live with my aunt. The paperwork arrived quietly, a formal seal on the independence I had been quietly fighting toward for months. Packing the last of my essentials, I took a moment to stand in my old bedroom, inhaling the scent of familiar walls, furniture, and memories. It was strange and heavy, like leaving a part of myself behind, but also liberating. The months of erasure, the quiet undermining, the threats, they had all been part of a narrative I would no longer inhabit. When I finally stepped out the door, boxes in hand and Aunt Teresa beside me, there was no fanfare. The street outside was the same as it had always been, yet it felt like a threshold into a new reality. My father remained on the porch, silent, defeated, while Dana's expression flickered between anger and disbelief. I didn't look back. That day, the control they had attempted to wield over my life, over my belongings, my choices, my future, finally ended. Moving into Aunt Teresa's home wasn't just a relocation. It was a reclamation of space, autonomy, and safety. Each step I took toward that house was a reminder that the future my mother had protected, and I had fought for, was still mine to claim. Weeks after I moved in with Aunt Teresa, I received the news that finally felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. The court had reviewed my father's petition to alter the education trust, and it was denied. Completely. The fund my mother had carefully set aside for my future remained untouched, exactly as she intended. I remember sitting on the edge of Aunt Teresa's couch, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. The messages started almost immediately after that, texts, calls, emails from my father and Dana. Some were angry, others guilt-laden, trying to convince me I was overreacting, that I was tearing the family apart. I didn't respond to any of them. Each notification that lit up my phone was a reminder that I no longer had to be drawn into the chaos they tried to impose on my life. Ignoring them wasn't easy at first. There was a part of me that flinched every time I saw his name. But slowly, it became an act of reclaiming control. Months later, my father finally showed up at Aunt Teresa's door. He looked different somehow, not just older, but worn, as though carrying the weight of what he'd let happen. When we sat down, he admitted something he'd never said before, that he had allowed Dana to influence him because he didn't want to confront his own grief over losing my mother. Hearing that didn't erase everything, and it certainly didn't undo the months of tension and manipulation, but it was a start. I made it clear that if we were going to rebuild any sort of relationship, it would require time, therapy, and consistent effort on his part. No shortcuts, no excuses. By the time I turned 18, I had full access to the inheritance my mother had set aside for my education. Holding the documents in my hands, I felt an unfamiliar but powerful sense of independence. I enrolled in university shortly after, choosing family counseling as my field of study. It wasn't just academic, it was personal. Every lecture, every assignment felt like reclaiming a part of my life that had been nearly stolen. Eventually, my father made the decision that I hadn't anticipated. He ended his marriage to Dana. The divorce was bitter, unsurprisingly, once it became clear that she would not be receiving any portion of the trust she'd spent years trying to access. I didn't witness every detail, but the news reached me, and I felt a quiet vindication. The house, the money, the decisions, they were finally beyond her reach. Looking back now, It's hard to believe how much control was wrested from me in such a short time, and yet, how decisively I reclaimed it. I live on my own terms, pursuing my studies, and every step forward feels like an assertion of the autonomy my mother had always fought to protect. I learned that walking away from the toxicity wasn't just survival, it was the moment I truly began my life on my own terms. I hope you enjoyed this story. If so, please like the video, share it with your family and friends, comment on it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enjoyable stories like this one.